Why is your Windows OS not booting from MBR or GPT? Have you ever faced the frustrating situation where your Windows operating system just won't boot? You might be wondering why this happens, especially when your disk is set up with either master boot record or GUID partition table. Let's break this down in a simple way to help you understand what might be going wrong. First, it's important to know how the boot process works. When you start your computer, it needs to load the bootloader from a specific partition on your disk. This depends on whether your disk uses master boot record or GUID partition table and what type of firmware your system has. If your disk is set up with master boot record, it relies on the older basic input-output system firmware to start the booting process. The basic input-output system reads the master boot record sector to locate the bootloader. On the other hand, if your disk uses GUID partition table, it works with the newer Unified Extensible Firmware interface. This modern firmware supports advanced features like secure boot and faster startup. Now, let's look at some common reasons why your Windows operating system might not boot. One major issue is a mismatch between your firmware and the partition scheme. If your system uses basic input-output system but your disk is set to GUID partition table, your Windows operating system will not boot. This is because basic input-output system cannot read the GUID partition table boot data. Conversely, if your system is set to Unified Extensible Firmware interface but your disk is using master boot record, booting will fail as well. Another reason could be incorrect boot mode settings. Unified Extensible Firmware interface systems often allow you to switch between Unified Extensible Firmware interface mode and legacy basic input-output system compatibility mode. If the boot mode does not match the disk partition style, booting will not succeed. You might also encounter issues if the bootloader is corrupted or missing. For disks using master boot record, the bootloader is located in the master boot record sector. If this area is damaged, it can prevent your system from booting. For GUID partition table disks, the bootloader information is stored in the FI system partitions. If these partitions are missing or corrupted, your Windows operating system will not boot. Partition table corruption can also be a problem. Master boot record stores all partition and boot data in a single sector. If this sector is corrupted, the disk may become unbootable. GUID partition table is more reliable as it stores multiple copies of partition data, but if all copies are damaged, boot failure can still occur. Additionally, the size of your disk and the number of partitions can impact booting. Master boot record only supports disks up to 2 terabytes and a maximum of for primary partitions. If you exceed these limits, boot issues may arise. GUID partition table supports larger disks and more partitions but requires Unified Extensible Firmware interface firmware to boot. Lastly, consider the compatibility of your operating system and architecture. Newer versions of Windows, specifically the 64-bit editions, requiring Unified Extensible Firmware interface firmware and GUID partition table disks to boot properly. Older versions or 32-bit editions may only boot with basic input-output system and master boot record. To ensure your Windows operating system boots correctly, start by confirming your system firmware type. Match your disk partition style accordingly. Check your firmware settings to enable the correct boot mode. Ensure that the bootloader and FI system partitions are intact. Use disk management tools to verify partition integrity and scheme compatibility. Understanding these elements is essential for troubleshooting boot failures and optimizing your system setup. By knowing how firmware, partition schemes, and operating system architecture interact, you can better manage your computer's boot process.